Sometimes it's firearms identification, so that's the microscopic comparison of fired ammunition components to firearms. I've also been qualified in shooting incident reconstruction.
And in terms of shooting incident reconstruction, did you do that kind of work in this case?
No, I did not.
And I apologize, we were having a technical difficulty here. In terms of the work that you did on this case, what areas of expertise have you been qualified as an expert in that apply to this case?
Sure. I would say those two areas are the examination of firearms and also firearms identification.
Okay, thank you, sir. We will ask the court to recognize, well, you know what, let me pause. Have you testified before?
Yes, I have.
And have you been qualified as an expert in other courts?
Yes, I have.
And how many other courts have qualified you as an expert?
13.
And are those all federal courts or state courts?
10 of those are federal, 3 were state.
Okay, thank you. I would ask the court to recognize Mr. Ziegler as an expert in firearms examination and firearms
identification.
Thank you, identification.
All right. You are recognized as an expert in examination of firearms and firearm identification.
Now, it's okay, thanks, you can have a seat. In this particular case, were you provided certain items of evidence for testing?
Yes, I was.
And approximately how many items of evidence were you provided for testing?
That's difficult to approximate because I was given a certain number of item numbers, but those item numbers may have, for example, 30 cartridges. So I believe that item numbers, I would say maybe around 50 items, but again, that could mean a much larger set of items.
Were you provided a firearm to examine in this case?
Yes, I was.
And did you have any understanding where that firearm came from?
I don't have personal knowledge of where the items of evidence are submitted from. They are generally submitted with some information that gets populated into our laboratory database. So I do have a description of that. That information gets populated into my lab report, but I don't have direct knowledge of where those items came from.
So what was your understanding, and I appreciate your qualification there, what was your understanding of where the firearm in this case came from that you administered some testing on?
So in this case, it was just labeled as a revolver. There was no description as to, for example, no address where that firearm was collected from.
You weren't given any information about whether it was collected from a movie set or whether it was a prop being used by an actor?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to leading.
Actually, I don't think that is leading.
Overruled.
I don't have that information.
Okay. I'm going to show you, what I have marked as State's Exhibit 97. May I approach? Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
What is
Your Honor,
that?
may I see that?
Mr. Ziegler, what did I just show you?
That is a photograph of the revolver that was submitted to my laboratory for examination.
Is this a revolver that you did testing on?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I'm going to move for the admission of State's Exhibit 97 and ask for permission to publish.
No objection.
All right, States 97 is admitted. You may publish. It was on my screen before.
And can I ask, is is there any way for me to only publish to that monitor so that I don't have to walk back and forth? Just to his monitor, so that it only goes to his and doesn't go to everybody else's when I'm going through the exhibits.
No, if it's published, well. You mean to recognize it?
Correct.
We would have to keep turning it on and off.
Okay.
Or else you could, yeah, that's what we'd have to do.
Okay. Why don't we just take a minute and let me see if I can get an agreement so that we don't have to do that.
Okay.
All right.
Great, thank you.
The state will move for the admission and permission to publish throughout Mr. Ziegler's testimony of State's Exhibit 97, 97A, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110.
So is it 97A through 110? Did you skip anything?
97, 97A, and then 98 through 110.
No
Any
objection, Your Honor.
All right, states 97 through 110 are admitted.
Every time we unplug it. All right, Mr. Ziegler, can we go ahead and put it up on the screen?
Yes.
Mr. Ziegler, tell us a little bit about this firearm that was provided to you. What kind of a gun is it? And just generally speaking, how does a gun like this operate?
So this is an image, a photograph of the revolver that was submitted. And this is a single action revolver. So that means that the hammer must be manually cocked by the shooter every time that the shooter intends to fire. So some revolvers, if you pull the trigger, it will do the work of cocking the hammer for you and releasing the hammer. This type of firearm does not have that ability. The shooter must physically cock the hammer each time. Is this a touchscreen by chance?
Yes.
Okay. So to point out a few key areas of this firearm, the portion on the left, don't believe him.
He's going to come help you.
Thank you. So the portion on the left in this photograph is the barrel. Towards the center, we have the cylinder. This back portion here is the hammer. We have the trigger near the bottom. And this wooden piece is the grip. So this is where you would hold the firearm. Let me clear this out. So basically, in order to get this firearm to function, you would have to load cartridges into the cylinder. This can be accomplished two ways. You can't see it in this photograph, but on the opposite side is what's called a loading gate. You can open and you then have access to the cylinder. So you can load each cartridge one at a time, rotating the cylinder until you have as many cartridges as you desire. You could also remove this pin here, remove the cylinder from the firearm, and load it that way. But regardless, once you load the cylinder, you must manually cock the hammer all the way to the rear And then at this point, this firearm would be ready to fire. So a pull of the trigger would release the firearm, or excuse me, the hammer. The hammer has a firing pin that's fixed to the hammer. So as the hammer falls, the firing pin would strike the primer of the cartridge and fire that cartridge.
Can you give us a quick description about the notches on the hammer and the different hammer positions?
Yes, so as you would cock this hammer, it has several safety notches by design. So as you cock it, you're going to hear a series of clicks, and those are the safety notches. So as you start to cock it, you're going to hear your first click. That's the quarter cock notch. If you continue to cock it, you'll hear your second click. That's the half cock notch. And if you cock it all the way, you'll hear the third click, and that's when it's in its fully cocked position. So those intermediate two cocking positions, they serve to do two things. Number one, when the hammer is completely at rest or not cocked at all, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So it's very difficult to see here, but in between this gap, between the cylinder and the frame, you would actually be able to see the firing pin sticking out. So as you start to cock it, it starts to remove the firing pin from protruding. So we don't want the firing pin making contact with the cartridges when we don't want it to. So it starts to retract the firing pin, and also if I'm cocking the hammer and my thumb slips off the hammer, you would expect that it's going to catch in one of those two safety notches. So this is to prevent the hammer from falling unless you want it to. So really this firearm is only designed to fire when the hammer is in its fully cocked position.
In terms of well, let me ask you this, the half cock notch, so that's going to be the second click that you hear when you're cocking the hammer, is that correct?
Correct.
Is there anything particular about the half cock position other than it being a safety?
Can you elaborate?
Sure. What position does the hammer have to be in order to load this gun with ammunition?
I understand. So you have to have the hammer retracted to a certain point to allow the cylinder to rotate freely. So there's a part, and it's on the inside here, called the cylinder stop, and that cylinder stop does not unlock until the hammer is pulled back to a certain point. So once it's pulled back to a certain degree, you can freely rotate the cylinder to load it with as many cartridges as you desire.
So in order to load and unload this gun, if you don't remove the pin and remove the cylinder, it has to be in the half cock position.
I'm not sure if it's somewhere between the quarter and the half cock, but it is in that intermediate area, yes.
So once you get it into the half cock position, what do you have to do to load it?
So I'll clear this out. Again, on the other side, there's a loading gate that you can open, and you then have access to the cylinder, so you can load it that way or remove the cylinder itself.
How many cylinder positions do you have access to when you open that loading gate?
Only one at a time, so you must manually rotate the cylinder and continue to load a single cartridge at a time.
So for those of us that are familiar with revolvers where you push a button and the entire cylinder kind of rolls out and you can load and unload that way, does this gun work that way?
No, those are going to be your more modern style revolvers.
If you noticed when you received this gun and you examined this gun, did this gun appear to be very old or relatively new, or were you not able to tell?
I'm not able to tell its age now.
Okay. Who is the manufacturer of this revolver?
The trade name is Pieta. It's an Italian company.
And do you know anything about Pieta and what they do, what they make?
I do know they have product lines they create new firearms that are essentially replicas of older firearms.
Is this a replica?
It's a replica in that it's an old design, but it's still a functioning firearm.
Now, if the hammer, let's talk about kind of hypothetically, let's assume that this gun is fully loaded with live ammunition. And we have the hammer in its resting position, so it's fully down. Is that the position it's in this photo?
Yes, it appears so.
So how is this gun designed in terms of safety with regard to possible accidental discharges when the hammer is in the fully rested?
Forward, as I mentioned earlier, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So if you have the cylinder fully loaded and the hammer is at rest on a chamber that has a live cartridge in it, that firing pin is actually sitting on the primer of that cartridge. So if I were either to strike the hammer or if I were to drop it and it landed on the hammer, it's going to fire that cartridge. So if you hit the hammer with enough force, it will detonate that primer in that position. And that's part of the design of this firearm. That's just how these are made. And if you were to look at the owner's manual, which this is one thing I did as part of my exam, you would actually see warnings not to carry this firearm with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber. So a lot of times it's actually advised that you load one less cartridge in the cylinder, so you have one empty chamber, and that's how it's carried with the hammer forward on that chamber. So these are recommendations in the owner's manual. So this isn't some phenomenon, this is something that's known about the design of these firearms.
And what kind of testing did you perform on this firearm?
So initially I did a function evaluation just to make sure it appeared that there weren't any odd modifications, that it was functioning correctly. After that, I was requested to do some microscopic comparisons, as I was also submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case. And then the last type of testing I did on this particular gun is what's called accidental discharge testing. So essentially the goal of that test is to see if I can get this firearm to function without pulling the trigger.
So the first set of testing that you mentioned, what did that entail?
So function examination is basically I need to inspect the firearm for safety purposes. Keep in mind I've never seen this firearm before when I first opened the box, so I don't know what condition it's been in, I don't know how old it is, I don't know how well it's been taken care of. So eventually I'm going to want to test fire that gun, so I need to make sure I feel that it's safe to fire so I don't have some catastrophic failure while I do so. Once I determine that it is safe to fire, I will physically take the gun to one of two locations in the FBI lab, and I will load it with ammunition from the laboratory and actually test fire the gun.
And did you test fire this gun?
Yes, I did.
Approximately how many rounds of ammunition did you fire out of this gun?
May I refer to my report?
Sure.
I physically fired this gun 12 times, so as a result of that, I retained the fired bullet and fired cartridge cases that I produced during that test firing. And I also collected some other cartridge cases as a product of the testing that I did. So these would be cartridge cases that I collected during the accidental discharge testing.
And the rounds that you fired, the 12 rounds that you fired out of this gun, were they evidence rounds or were those rounds that were supplied by the FBI?
They were FBI cartridges, and then once I fire them in the evidence firearm, they become what's called secondary evidence. And essentially, if I have to conduct microscopic comparisons at a later point, that secondary evidence, they now become my knowns. I know they came from that firearm because I physically shot it and collected those items.
All right, thank you. Tell us about the second group of testing that you did.
Right, that was the microscopic comparisons. So again, I was submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case, and essentially I was asked to determine if, in my opinion, I could determine if those two items were fired by this particular revolver.
Okay, and let me back you up for a moment. Did you examine rounds of ammunition as a part of your forensic examination in this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you examine dummy rounds?
Yes, I did.
Did you examine live rounds?
Yes.
Did you examine live rounds? Well, did you examine live rounds that you understood to be provided by someone named Seth Kinney?
Yes, there were some cartridges that were submitted, and they were declared to be live rounds as they were submitted.
Did you examine live ammunition that came from a location that you were notified was 126 Monroe Street?
Your Honor, I object to leading.
I'm not leading, I'm just asking him a direct question.
May I review my...
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, I do have some item numbers that have that address in their item description.
Did you also examine live ammunition that came from the set of the movie Rust?
Yes, I did.
And when you examined that ammunition, what did that entail?
So the evaluation of the ammunition kind of took place in a couple different phases. So first, I just looked at the physical characteristics. So I evaluated its appearance from the outside. And based on that, I started to segregate these types of ammunition into groups just based on their physical appearance. So I could put them into groups. For example, some of them appeared to be live cartridges, so I had that group. Some of them appeared to be dummy rounds, and so they may have some physical visual clue that they may be a dummy. So for instance, some of them had holes drilled into the side of them. So I could look into the cartridge and see there was no powder present. Some of them, when you shake them, there are actual BBs inside. So that produces an audible indicator that even though this looks to be a live cartridge, in reality there's nothing on the inside. So I can shake it, and that's another indicator that that may be a dummy. There were a series of blanks, which a blank does not have a bullet. It still has a primer and gas, but it's not meant to actually fire a projectile. So I started to form these groups just based on their physical characteristics. I then x-rayed all the ammunition because I could hear some of these cartridges it sounded like BBs inside when you shook them. So I wanted to get an idea of just a picture of what was going on inside these cartridges. So again, I took those two pieces of information, sorted them into groups, and then eventually I worked with the contributor to determine which of these cartridges actually need to be disassembled. So we can take out the bullet and we can look inside and see, is there any powder present? Does it look like the primer is active or not? So those were kind of the three phases to sort of determine which categories these cartridges actually fell into.
Okay, and quickly I'm going to jump you to the accidental discharge testing that you did. Can you summarize for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that accidental discharge testing consisted of and why you did that testing?
Right, so again, accidental discharge, its goal is essentially to determine, can I fire this firearm without pulling the trigger? That's kind of the end goal. And the way we do that is the test banged into something, just being jostled around, and seeing, can those kind of interactions fire the firearm? So the way we replicate this in the laboratory is I will take the gun,